From a base coat of Wraithbone Spray, paint the entire chest with Wyldwood. It doesn't matter if you cover the metal areas, as this will allow for easier coverage of the metallic paint in the next step. Paint all of the metallic areas with Leadbelcher, and with this paint I would go for 2 thin coats, as Citadel metallics tend to clump in thicker layers, so take your time with it and just make sure it's a smooth finish. Shade the silver with Nuln Oil. You could probably do 2 layers of the Nuln Oil in this case. I just did the one, and noting you can use overspill onto the wooden areas to blackline, so it's kind of making the details pop out a bit more, so don't worry if there's any spillage onto the edges of the wood. Highlight the silver now with Stormhost Silver. My approach in these smaller models is almost akin to kind of a very small dry brush, using an old fine tip brush, and then with most of the paint removed onto a paper towel, just kind of paint all over the metallics. It doesn't actually have to be neat, and the more irregular the finish, the more realistic it will be. The other option, to pick out all the sharpest edges, would take forever and really isn't worth it. For the rust effect, start with a thin down layer of Doombull Brown. This first step, and actually the next step as well, the paint's going to be quite thin, as you're not trying to pick out detail, you're just trying to kind of set the base coats for the remaining colours. Pick out areas you think rust, or rather where water would accumulate to develop rust, but you don't need to pick out, say, every rivet or every area. Some irregularity will make it look more natural. And again, when you're using this paint, use it quite thin. It'll actually dry much duller than it'll look here now at the moment, so don't worry about putting too much paint on. As long as it's thin, it'll be fine. Repeat this approach now with thinned Skrag Brown paint, covering smaller areas. So any of the larger areas, Doombull Brown, don't cover the entirety of them, just pick out a smaller area in the middle of it. This starts to build up the kind of multi-layered effect to the rust and allows it to look more organic. Colour is Trollslayer Orange. At this point I wouldn't really thin the paint down much at all, because you want to be more stippled in the appearance than the previous underlayers. So with relatively undiluted paint, using stippling motion, pick out the central areas of the rust effects. As you can see here, in the larger areas, kind of stipple in 2 or 3 different places. And the final colour is Fire Dragon Bright. Now this is quite a bright colour and really only needs small amounts stippled into the centre of the brighter areas. As you can see, it kind of breaks up the uniformity of the previous colours underneath and really sells it as a kind of an organic rust effect. In this case, much like the previous step, don't dilute down the paint at all. And in fact, in this example, I put the paint onto the tip of the brush and then ran it over the paper towel much like a dry brush, so that the paint remaining on the brush had very little other than pigment, which allowed it to sit exactly where you tip the brush off the model. The moss effect is actually completed in quite a similar way to the rust, just using different colours and covering bigger areas. So starting with stippled Castellan Green over the areas on the wood that you want to have moss or lichen or whatever you want to call it. Your choice of colours could vary. I ended up going with a green to offset against the rust, and pick out reasonably large areas, but try not to cover too much of the wood effect, or you'll end up basically with a green treasure chest. As this is dried, repeat the approach with a stippling of Loren Forest. You can see in this example again, old brushes are great for this. This is an old, I think, medium layer brush with a very frayed tip, but with dry paint this allows to give a kind of a irregular pattern on the greens as it builds up in layers. Finally, complete the effect with stippled Nurgling Green. You can see I've moved to a smaller brush and really trying to pick out small speckles in the middle of the green, again making the effect look more organic and less just like painted layers onto the model. And with this, the moss effect then is completed. And this is the finished result. If you like this painting tutorial, please feel free to check out the channel where I have numerous other painting tutorials.